For the SEC to be undefeated when it comes to hypotheticals, I was expecting a way better outing out of this conference than what we saw during the playoffs. This is the second straight year that we're going to have a national championship without a team from the SEC in it. And during this playoffs, you had Tennessee, Georgia, Texas. They all lost by more or at least 2 possessions. They lost on an average margin of 17 points. Now, that's a little bit inflated because of how bad of a loss Tennessee took to Ohio State in the first round, but the SEC just didn't bring their A game this year in the expanded 12-team college football playoffs. And initially, when the playoffs first initially expanded from 4 to 12 teams, there was a lot of conversation about how the SEC was guaranteed to win it all every single year with more teams being able to get in. And all that's happened is the complete polar opposite of what was expected. Because the SEC, not only did you get less teams in than what you initially expected, but, you can make the argument that Tennessee didn't belong in the playoffs this year. They didn't look like one of the best 12 teams in college football, in my opinion. Their best win, to me, was against Alabama. Nico Iamaleava, with him being so young and that offense being heavily dependent on Dylan Sampson, they didn't really look like a team that had a chance to win it all. And their defense, for as good as how they played for the majority of the regular season, Ohio State was driving up and down the field against them like they were practicing against air. The way that Tennessee-Ohio State game went, you would have thought it was an exhibition matchup. I thought we was watching the spring game with how easy Ohio State was making it look against Tennessee. And then, who would have thought that Georgia would have lost to Notre Dame? I'm not trying to undersell Notre Dame, but 3 years ago, nobody would have ever expected for Notre Dame to beat Georgia and to beat them by 2 possessions at that. Notre Dame, the way they handled Georgia, you never really questioned who the better team was. From start to finish, Notre Dame just was downright way better than what Georgia was. And Georgia has a way more talented roster compared to what Notre Dame has. And then Texas, they got fortunate enough that they beat Clemson, they beat Arizona State. You expect a SEC opponent to be able to take care of a Big 12 foe or any other team outside of the Big 10. But the way they lost against Texas, although they did show a lot of heart in that game, at the end, the final score shows 28-14. You expect that game to at least come down to a touchdown or less. Because Texas poured as much money into this year's team as what Ohio State did into theirs. So there is no reasoning for Texas to lose in the fashion that they did. And for the SEC to have been as dominant as what it's been for over the last 2 decades, it's safe to say that this year's playoffs showed us that their reign of dominance over college football has officially came to an end. Now, I'm not saying that the SEC is not going to be able to bounce back next year, but what this shows is that there is a pendulum now that has swung in college football. It looks like the Big Ten has now started to cement themselves as the top dog in college football now. Now, that could be due to a bunch of reasons, but the main one is that the SEC isn't the only team that has money to throw around. Ohio State put $20 million into this 2024 team. You got Michigan, who has Dave Portnoy now, the owner of Barstool, who's pouring money into that program. You got a lot of teams in the middle portion of the country that have a lot of NIL money. And you look at Alabama, you look at Brian Kelly, who is begging his fans to donate to LSU's NIL fund. I think that the SEC is now starting to get scared because they now are quickly starting to realize that the Big Ten has caught up to them. They, for so long, it's been this perception that they've been the only conference that's had enough money to be able to consistently put together an elite team year in and year out. Even if they were to lose a few players in the portal, they could overcome those losses. But outside of Texas and Oklahoma and maybe a few other schools in the SEC, like Florida has a pretty strong NIL backing, which kind of surprised me because Florida kind of is in the middle of nowhere. If you ever been to Gainesville, Florida, you would know that it's a very country area. You know, for Florida to have such a big NIL backing, it just shocks me where when you think about where that school is located. But the rest of the country has money to spend in NIL as well. Texas Tech has been throwing a lot of money into their NIL fund. They have like a top 3, top 5 portal class that they're bringing into this season. So the SEC, within the next 2 or 3 years from now, not only is the Big Ten going to catch up to this conference, but the Big 12 is, and so is the ACC, because the SEC now, their big advantage for so many decades has been that we have the best athletes, we have the best coaches, where you no longer can say that anymore, because the Big Ten has really good coaches. You got Jedd Fisch. I still believe in Lincoln Riley. You got Dan Lanning. Eventually, he's going to break through. We don't really know about Sharon Moore yet, but Ryan Day, it looks like he's very well on his way to cementing himself as one of the elites in college football, claiming his first national championship if he's able to take down the Fighting Irish. So, I mean, the SEC, you got a really bad wake-up call in the playoffs this year. You went out really sad. Every time you log into social media, you see these SEC hypotheticals. Well, if Alabama got in, they would have been favored over Notre Dame. They would have been favored over Indiana. They would have been favored over SMU. That's why you play the games. Expanding the playoffs, initially when the idea first came to fruition, I thought it was terrible. I thought that it was going to devalue the importance of the regular season. And I thought that all it was going to do was further make it easier for the SEC to continue to keep their monopoly over college football. But this thing did not go the way that I expected it to. And in the foreseeable future, if we expand to more teams, I think the SEC is quickly going to find out that they no longer are what they thought they were. And what's even more surprising is that, believe it or not, the Big Ten and the SEC, they got the highest revenue share out of all the teams in the college football playoffs outside of Notre Dame, because they're not in the conference and they don't have to worry about splitting revenue with anybody else. I think eventually, if the SEC continues to underperform in the postseason, some of these other conferences like the ACC and the Big 12, they're going to have a little bit of some say in the revenue splits, and they're going to have to say, hey, like, y'all ain't the top dogs no more. You feel me? Our conference is just as good as your conference, so how about we split a little bit more of the pie, a little bit more equally? And, you know, there was some rumblings about how if the SEC didn't get their way, depending on how the committee judged their conference, they was going to take their belongings, disassociate themselves from the rest of the NCAA, partner up with the Big Ten, and create somewhat of the equivalent to what the AFC and the NFC conferences are in the NFL. And we will have like 2 mega conferences. Well, I don't see that happening anymore. To me, it looks like we finally have gotten what we've been asking for so long, which is parity. Yeah, we still have Ohio State in the national championship, but we got Notre Dame in the national championship. And I think a few years from now, we will see a team that kind of comes out of nowhere and starts competing for national championships. Maybe it's Colorado. Maybe it's Arizona State. Hell, maybe it ends up being Clemson right back in the forefront, because Clemson, they've been spending a lot of money in the portal relative to what they've done in years past. They're firing coaches now. It looks like Dabo Swinney sees an opportunity to get back into the national title conversation with how vulnerable the SEC looks right now. So for all of you SEC fans out there that like to float around these hypotheticals, how are you feeling now? Undefeated in hypotheticals, but you're losing in the playoffs. Embarrassing. You went out really sad this year. And not just in the playoffs, but, you know, in the non-playoff matchups. In bowl season, Alabama got handled by Michigan. Texas A&M choked against USC. I mean, the SEC, we got a lot more questions than we have answers about the future of this conference moving forward into the 2025 season.